Kate Edwards, president of Together Hospitality. I'm here today with Kirk.
Hey, Kirk with LG Construction. I run the division that does a lot of the restaurant build-outs in the city.
You sure do.
Yeah.
Something
love
that
it.
something that we were talking about though is, people think of a contractor as just coming in, doing the build out and getting out, but that's really not true.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what our clients are looking for is really a partner in the process. Early on, we, often, I would say 99% of our projects, we don't have a set of plans to work from initially. We're really brought in on the concept phase. Once a space is kind of being looked at, we'll really be brought in to we kind of try to quarterback it all, and there's so many different parties that need to be involved in terms of opening a restaurant. Between the landlord, the individual subcontractors and consultants that they have to bring in, so the architect, the engineers, everybody. And so we have a background in that. We understand the role that everyone has to play in that. And so we really try to think about early on in the process what those elements are and what they're going to cost, and how and when they should be integrated with the client, to make sure that when they're even just looking at the space, they have a real concept of what the budget in totality is going to be. Because in the end, they are often operators at heart, and not designers, not contractors. And so we try to help as much as possible.
Yeah, so that budget is key, and so much of the budget is in that build out. So how do you help people manage those costs?
Well, I think the big understanding is what each one of those costs are going to be. And so we will itemize a breakdown budget, and we will have all of the different components that would go into building out a project, and a lot of it's kind of on us. And so we'll say, hey, on a per square foot basis, you're about this for the floor. And so we'll kind of give that framework, and then it becomes a discussion, in terms of, hey, we feel that this is going to be a high-end concept. There's going to be lots of wall finishes, lots of ceiling finishes, or it's going to be fairly bare bones. And that's, for us, largely the easy side of things. The harder ones is that in that budget will also be all of the things that is often on the owner's side of the ledger, essentially. Items like FF&E, the chairs, and the booths and banquettes. A lot of times that's not something that is in our costs. The audiovisual is one that's often brought in.
Wow.
And so there's like all of these other consultants that they're not thinking of. And then also understanding, their budget. They have a budget in their head, and they might say, yep, we have $1.5 million to spend. That's very different if it's including the kitchen equipment or not including the kitchen equipment, if it's including their small wares, all of those things. So those are the questions that we ask early on, so that, again, it's very clear and kind of reducing the complicated to the simple. So that's kind of what we try to do, and have those conversations early on, so that it doesn't get to a point where you think one thing, you pull the trigger, and then all of a sudden the budget balloons because there was a misconception or an idea that wasn't fully vetted.
Right.
So.
Right. So what gets them to a finished concept in budget is a bigger picture thing sometimes.
Yeah, and it's not something that happens quickly. It's a process. And so a lot of times what we do is we start there, and then we work, what we term pre-construction. So much of, it's easier to steer a ship early on that's big than try to do it right at the end. And so really it's having those conversations in those meetings early on to kind of get to a point where, okay, when we have a set of plans, it actually meets the budget, versus working solely in a vacuum with an architect, with a designer, and then putting it out to bid to a bunch of contractors, and all of a sudden, okay, we're 20% over what we should be. So yeah.
So one of the trends that I've seen is that a lot of operators have been scooping up these pre-existing restaurants. Because, post-pandemic, there were deals, I don't know if there's still deals. But the thinking is, oh, I've got this fitted restaurant, I'm good to go, I'm saving all this money, but there's inherent booby traps. There's
Yeah.
things that are there that might not actually serve you in the best way. What have you seen?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that a lot of people assume that it's kind of a one size fits all in terms of the restaurant, and really it's what we find is that it's concept driven. So the concept really drives not only just the aesthetics from the design and whatnot, but really the what we term kind of the MEPs and the technical elements, which is what's needed from a kitchen standpoint. And so a recent example is that, okay, we have a kitchen, there's an existing black iron, which is how essentially the exhaust from all the kitchen gets exhausted to the outside. We're going to be good. But the problem is that that concept was very light on greasy foods and whatnot. And so the new concept that came in was going to be, actually grilling a lot of steaks and doing a lot more in terms of utilizing that system. And unfortunately, that system, that black iron was not sized properly, nor was it code. And so really identifying that early on and saying, okay, well, this isn't going to work, and you're going to have to replace it, and this is how we think it should be replaced as cost efficiently as possible, and this is what the cost is going to be. And so that all factored into the equation and became a variable, and they're still going to go ahead with it, but now that was all pre-lease, as opposed to post-lease, and that's where the really the value component lies, because now they can incorporate it in their negotiations, and it's not too far down the line.
So to that point, it's essential with an existing space that they get you in to make sure that the space is something that will truly be they can use it properly for their concept.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then hit their goals with their budget.
Yeah. What's a classic one is how is operationally how is this space going to be used? Is there going to be a large patio where there's going to be a lot of movement in and out of the space? How is the existing space set up for that? And so they might come and look at it and say, hey, I love the storefront, it looks good, we're not going to touch it. But then all of a sudden, operationally, like I said, well, half of our business is going to be outside in the summer, and we need access to the space. So, okay, we're going to have to adjust the storefront. Well, if it's custom storefront, then that affects what the cost of that's going to be. Instead of $60 a square foot for standard storefront, it might be $120 a square foot. And so really thinking about the concept and understanding how it gets integrated with that space is key. And honestly, it's the stuff that we love to do. And unfortunately, like sometimes what happens is that space doesn't work. 6 months later, then we talk about it in another space, because but it's better we talk about it then and not further down the line when they have to try to raise more capital and can't find it and stuff like that. So.
Which is where your expertise or experience in really focusing on restaurants really comes to bear.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we love restaurants. We have our checklist. We have a checklist of essentially all of the change orders that we had in the past. What could we have thought about early on? What could the architect have thought about? What could the owner have thought about? What could the landlord have thought about? Like all of these different factors and inputs that could have been thought about early on to prevent something again at a later date when you didn't have a choice between X and Y. It had to be Y, and that's really the key, is being able to have a choice up front, and so that's our focus.
So valuable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.